Lester, in Christian philosophy, looking at the New Testament, looking at the meaning of the total Christian worldview, eschatology, the end times are very important in terms of what may happen in the future for everyone, and indeed what the New Testament was looking to in its own context. Did they expect the end time then? And if they did, and it didn't happen, what does that reflect upon it? I want to come to you and give me a perspective of the world at that time as a Second Temple expert covering the period of early Christianity. What were sort of end time thinking during that whole period of time?
That's the concept seems to have developed somewhat late. We do have within some of the biblical prophetic books the idea that something would happen to Israel, but the idea of end time, as we think of the end of the world, doesn't seem to be a part of the thinking, at least so far as we can tell. It probably is in the late Persian or perhaps even the Greek times we began to see some sort of concept. We have in Isaiah 24 to 27, the Isaiah Apocalypse might have something along that line. And we began to get apocalyptic writings which do have the idea of the end of the world somewhere around 300 or so.
Before the Common Era.
Before the Common Era. And one of the earliest, of course, is the book of Daniel. And there you definitely have an expectation of the end time. But it's interesting, Daniel is written during the Maccabean Revolt. According to a number of writings, according to the Maccabees and according to Daniel, the Jewish religion was forbidden by Antiochus Epiphanes, which was a very unusual thing because normally polytheists didn't persecute religions. So why that happened is still debated. But the thing is that Daniel expected the end time in his time. If you read Daniel 11, it's very interesting because Daniel 11 follows historically. It's in code, but it very clearly outlines history. And suddenly about verse 40, it says, at the time of the end. And then it talks about the king of the north and the king of the south, and the king of the north would come into the pleasant land in Palestine. And God would intervene. And then you go into 12, you get the resurrection and so on. The writer of Daniel clearly expected the end time to be in his time. And you can understand because the temple had been polluted. And to a Jew at that time, the pollution of the temple was a cosmic event. This wasn't just something that happened. It actually shook the world to its foundations. And therefore the writer was expecting the end time. And so when we start looking at Jewish literature, after Daniel, we do see now and then people seeming to expect the end time. We have about the same time as Daniel. We have in 1st Enoch 85 to 90, we have the animal apocalypse. And they clearly expect, and Judas Maccabeus seems to be referred to in symbol at that point. But they seem to expect God's kingdom to be set up at that time, in the Maccabean time. So it's similar to Daniel. Well, obviously that didn't happen. But when we come down to the New Testament, we have various references in the New Testament. Paul talks about we, as if the resurrection would happen or the return of Christ would be in his own time, and so on. So there seems to be an expectation, which probably had carried along from an earlier time. Doesn't mean every Jew thought that, but many did. But then Jerusalem fell in 70. We have the Gospel of Mark, we have in Mark 13, we have in Matthew 24, we have the so-called Olivet prophecy of Jesus, which seems to be talking about, well, it's about the end time and the end of the world and everything. And when we look at, when Josephus tells us about the final siege of Jerusalem, he talks about a group of Jews who met in the porch of the temple. I think he says, I believe he uses the term 6,000. I may be misremembering that. But anyway, a whole large group were apparently expecting to be rescued, probably by divine intervention. Now, it's not completely clear why they were expecting that, but my investigations of it suggest that it was an interpretation of, again, of Daniel, of the Daniel 9, the 70 weeks prophecy, that they had calculated that God would intervene at this time and that it fitted with their chronology. But of course, that didn't happen, and most of them were slaughtered. But interestingly, despite the fall of Jerusalem, the end time, the expectations of the end time still continued for a number of decades. For instance, around the year 100 of the Common Era, we have the Christian revelation of John, or Apocalypse of John as it's often called. We have 4th Ezra, or 2nd Esdras as it's sometimes called. We have 2nd Baruch. We have the Apocalypse of Abraham, Jewish writings that also expected an end time, all written about the same time, about 100 of the Common Era. They're all expecting the Roman Empire to fall. In the Revelation of John, the Roman Empire is going to be destroyed. It's called Babylon, but it seems clear that it's referring to Rome. We have in the 4th Ezra, he has a vision of an eagle, which represents the Roman Empire, and it ends up being destroyed, and the Messiah appears, and so on. So we get expectations of the end time. It didn't happen, of course. Then in 115 to 117, there was a revolt, a Jewish revolt, mainly Mesopotamia, probably not Palestine, we're not sure. But then in 132 to 135, we have Bar Kokhba revolts, is destroyed, and a lot of Jews sold into slavery, a major upheaval. And at that point, suddenly the eschatological expectations in Judaism seem to come to an end for many centuries. And within rabbinic literature, they're not in the Mishnah, there's no reference to Messiah, no reference to eschatology. Later in the Talmud, it sort of comes back, but it's put off to a later time. It fits a different worldview. They had gone through this period where they had finally lost all expectations of God's intervention.
But certainly during the period of the New Testament formation and early Christianity, it was this very rich time of expecting the end time, based on the flow from Daniel and all of the activities for the previous 3 centuries, as you described it. During that whole period, you had kind of an end-time fervor in which the New Testament fit naturally, without even thinking about a divine revelations of any kind, but within the socio-political fervor at the time, end times were part of the zeitgeist of the time.
That's correct, yeah. And Christianity at different times, and also in Judaism, you do have certain groups arise. You have messianic movements now and then come up. You have, for instance, in the 16th century, 15th century, you have a Shabbatai Tzvi, a major movement that claims to be the Messiah. He later, at the very end of his life, converts to Islam after he's captured by in the Islamic world and so on. So you do have at times, and in Christianity, it's interesting, Christians calculated that Jesus was born in the year 5,500 of the age of the world, and therefore that some expected in the year 6,000, in other words, about 500, there might, maybe Christ would return. So there are times when the fervor comes up again, but generally, most of the church fathers, certainly after the 2nd century or so, tend to dismiss it as being, for the far future, not immediate.